My clock must be losing time because I turned it right to that at the beginning of the last session, and it apparently has good. We have a couple stragglers. Apparently, then that's the right time. So we'll just get going here, folks. Welcome to the last breakout session. My name is Christian Keller. I'm a professor of history at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, just up the road. I am a local. I'm from Carlisle and have landed back home. It's a delight. We led the Chancellor's little staff ride yesterday, and that was a delight too. We dodged the rainstorms, as I understand you did here, and got back at a reasonable hour, which is quite a victory considering Virginia, the chances of traffic. What we're going to do today, folks, is talk a little bit about the experience of German America in the Civil War as seen through the eyes of the soldiery in the Army of the Potomac and their experiences in the East particularly. And I'd like to start out with a couple caveats so we're on the same page when we talk about German Americans in the Civil War era. Those of you that may have taken a look at my first book, Damn Dutch, and I promise I'm not going to constantly make plugs like other people, but there's so little that's written actually on German Americans in the war that I find that I have to sometimes go back to my earlier work to help explain things. There's an automatic misconception that sometimes arises in people's minds about who the Germans were. And we hear this word Dutchmen said all the time in 19th century parlance. Well, who and what was a Dutchman? A Dutchman was a perversion of the German word Deutsch, or Deutschmann, or Deutscher, and it's an Anglo-American mistake. And it was applied initially to the people that lived in these places. The Pennsylvania Dutch, as they're called today, are actually of direct German lineage. They were Germans, and they were descendants of the colonial era immigration. And they were a world apart, quite literally, in time and space from the immigrant Germans who settled in the great cities of the North in the 1840s and 50s. So you've got a difference in time spent in the United States, and therefore generations spent as Americans, and those that had just come into the United States as recent immigrants and were therefore coming in with all kinds of experiences from Europe, such as the failure of the 1848 democratic revolutions in Europe, massively affecting how the Germans are going to think about this war, and their leaders that will come into being in charge of the German regiments, as we'll talk about. But I want to make it clear that we've got two subcultures within German ethnicity in the United States at this time. You've got the immigrant Germans of the cities, and then you've got the Pennsylvania Dutch of the farms. And the Pennsylvania Dutch actually extend into Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin. There are these families that are descendants of the old Pennsylvania immigration from the colonial era that have now gone out into the western states, and they have formed their own little enclaves out there. So it's not just in Pennsylvania. In fact, interestingly, some of these folks went down the Great Valley of Virginia in the early 1800s, the end of the 1700s. They will form, along with the Scots-Irish, the backbone of the Valley Regiments that will march with Stonewall Jackson. So you've got Pennsylvania Dutch fighting for the Confederacy because they've been there in the Valley for generations, but they are descendants of the original Pennsylvania immigrants that had come in the early Republic, in the early era of the country's existence. Two different subcultures, therefore, and we're going to focus today primarily on the Germans who had come as immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s. Not on the Pennsylvania Dutch, though they also play a bit of a role here and did have some interaction with their more recently emigrated cousins. So let's start with these folks. This is obviously a different environment than living on a farm. And the people who came into the great cities of the North, the immigrants from Ireland and Germany primarily, came looking for economic opportunity first and foremost. Some of them were coming to escape religious persecution, though that was a much smaller reason compared to what it was in the colonial era. Some are coming to escape the failure of democracy in Europe. This was Germany's first attempt to establish democracy. It failed at the point of Prussian bayonets. And the leaders of the failed 48 revolution in Europe will mainly emigrate to the United States. These are men like Carl Schurz, might have heard of him, Franz Siegel, Weizmann Siegel, Ludwig Blenker, Friedrich Kapp, and Augustus Willich. Names that you may have run into over the course of your research and your studies. They will become the natural leaders of German America in the antebellum years. And it will be around them that the core of the military units of Germans will coalesce and form, because these guys have political connections. They command votes. Even if they are primarily Republican, and the rank and file of German immigrants are Democratic, it's their reputation from the old country that inspires allegiance and inspires followership. So these guys may even be more to the left of the Republican Party than the hardcore Anglo-American Republicans. But they will get the Democratic German rank and file to follow them because of their reputation. And this is the case with Karl Schurz, for instance, who was a great supporter of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. He's a political appointee, a political general, turns out actually pretty good compared to many of the other ones. Franz Siegel had led the retreat into Switzerland of the defeated revolutionary armies, and therefore had an incredible reputation among his German-American countrymen when he comes to St. Louis in the early 1850s. Will serve as an instructor there of various studies in some German academies. And when the war breaks out, the Germans of the North are going to follow the lead of their leaders. A lot of them 48ers, some of them old Democratic leaders that had come from the earlier immigration or were themselves from the 1850 immigration. And the general reaction in the German-American community writ large throughout the North was, the flag's been fired upon, this is our adopted homeland, we are obligated to defend it. This adopted homeland has given us a lot of good things, we're going to try to preserve that. We don't like the idea of secession because it means the chance of the restoration of monarchy and petty princes and the disruption of what we think is a more egalitarian society than we ever had back home in Germany. Remember, Germany's not unified yet. It's still very autocratic. And even if they didn't come here for political freedom, they didn't like that kind of problem they had in Germany. They're glad for what they got here. They also are thinking, if we enlist in great numbers, we can show our ethnic pride, and we can prove to the Anglo-Americans, some of whom are very skeptical about our value to the Union, our worth as citizens. The Irish also had this. Their experiences in enlistment mirrored the Germans in this way. They too wanted to show we are good adopted citizens. We want to show everybody else that we are as good as the next guy. Now, the Irish spoke primarily English. There was some Gaelic. So they had that going for them. What was against the Irish was the fact that they were very generally unskilled laborers and Catholic. That bothered a lot of Americans in the 1850s because they were seen as lower class and threats to the normal standards of society. Plus, they often drank too much whiskey. This myth was created that the Irish are always drunk. Not true. But the problem here for the Germans is they didn't have the same issue. They spoke a foreign language, and some of them were Catholic, and hence the nativists of the 1850s saw the Germans also as problems, but for different reasons from the Irish. They wanted their votes on one hand, but they really looked at them askance on the other. The Germans came in with more capital at their disposal. They tended to be tradesmen. They opened breweries, bakeries, little machine shops in both the North and the South before the war. And they have a vested interest, therefore, in the societies that they have joined, both predominantly Anglo-American, or in the case of some of these cities, they were in entirely ethnic wards. Philadelphia had 5 wards that were all ethnically German. New York had more. They had like 8 that were all ethnic neighborhoods, little Germanies, as we call them. From these little Germanies within the great cities of the North are going to march the ethnic regiments. Totally German-speaking units. Entire regiments formed of German speakers. We're going to see 5 of them come out of Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, about 9 out of New York City. We're going to see 3 come out of Milwaukee, and that's just a sampling. Large numbers of ethnically German regiments. In the Western theater of operations, these ethnic units are going to be brigaded with Anglo-American regiments. They will therefore not be put together in large, easily identifiable brigades and divisions. That is a difference that we need to understand when we think about the Army of the Potomac. The Western German regiments that came out of the Western states are not on a high-profile status. Kind of help that they're going to be fighting under Grant and Sherman, too. Eastern German regiments are very quickly brigaded into all German commands and ultimately into an all-German division, which will be formed outside of Washington at a place called Hunter's Chapel, essentially modern-day Arlington, and serve as a guard to Western approaches to Washington at the very beginning of the war. An entire German division, 5,000. We talk about the Irish Brigade and get all excited about that. There was a whole German division. Now, here's a funny thing that you might be interested in. If you were an Anglo-American at the time, even educated ones, and you ran into someone who spoke a foreign language that wasn't French, you called them a Dutchman. It was just the catch-all misnomer, if you will. So even Russians were put in as Dutchmen. And interestingly, these ethnic units that were of mixed nationality, like the 39th New York, the Garibaldi Guard, you've heard of that, commanded and led by Italians. They had 2 or 3 Italian companies in it. It was primarily a German organization. But even though it had this ethnically Italian flavor, it's put in with the Germans. So this German division that's formed in 1861 outside of Washington has other nationalities in it. This is one of the things that I want you to know. It's not totally German organization, but it's very close. It's about 90% German. Commanded by a guy named Ludwig Blenker, one of these 48ers. Very proud of his ethnicity, very purposeful in ensuring that German ethnicity will be preserved under his command. He does not want non-German recruits coming into the German division. There are beer privileges given to the German soldiers that are not allowed for the Anglo-American soldiers, so when the beer privilege was issued, suddenly the Germans had lots of friends that descended upon them from all the neighboring brigades and divisions. Blenker saw that as a lack of discipline and a problem for order, and so he actually revoked the beer privilege, but it didn't happen officially. They kept getting their beer the whole way through the Chancellorsville campaign, after which Howard officially revoked it, which really went over badly. The Germans got black bread instead of white. They got special wursts and sausages that their sutlers came with. They had all German sutlers in service then, who were coming from these areas of the north. They also lined their camps with little trees and conifers and had decorations in German and German colors on their buntings. Very orderly camps. Music was everywhere in German camps. One visitor said the Germans wake up singing and go to bed singing. Their regimental band, very well known for their quality throughout the Army of the Potomac. This is how the German division gets its start. Now, there was also a bit of negativity going on here too, because Blenker was a rather pompous individual, and this is going to start a negative trend too. Blenker was known for holding grand reviews with a fluttering array of aide-de-camps, a number in the hundreds. In all kinds of foreign-looking uniforms, and he liked to strut around Washington looking important, pumping his chest. It didn't go over well with some of the more stoic Anglo-Americans. And they started looking at these foreigners with askance, saying, well, they're making a good show. Let's see what happens when the bullets start to fly. Blenker doesn't get into First Manassas. Not too many, not really any German participation there at all. But in the early spring of 1862, the entire German division was ordered west to the Shenandoah Valley to try to bag Stonewall Jackson. And here's where we start to see some problems develop for what will become later the 11th Corps, residues, if you will. You got the residue of nativism that exists from the 1850s and the old Know-Nothing Party, that was a nativist party, temporarily subsumed the Whigs for a while. It looked like it was going to be the great rival to the Democrats, and then it couldn't handle the slavery problem, and Kansas, Nebraska killed it. And the Republicans will rise out of this, taking advantage of it politically. They will absorb the know-nothings. The residue of nativism, this anti-foreign thought process, extend naturalization laws for the foreign-born. Don't give them voting rights right away. Don't let them have their beer gardens on Sunday. Things like this. This is prevalent in the northern public, the Anglo-American public. So that's sitting out there hovering. It's very, very evident in the northern rank and file and leadership also in the Army of the Potomac. So they have absorbed a lot of this. Okay? Now you've got the German division actually in action. Well, how does it do? Unfortunately, its entry into the public spotlight in a military sense is not that favorable. They are given 2 days' notice to leave camp outside of Washington, 6 ambulances to an entire division. The men ordered not to take tents. They endure 4 separate snowfalls where the men wake up with at least 6 inches of snow on top of them. They are sick. The commissary department, the War Department at that time, Union supply was not perfected yet. These soldiers are suffering. The wagons are not catching up to the fast-moving columns. The soldiers are starving in the field. If you were they, what would you do? You would either desert, which most of them didn't do, which is very interesting. The muster rolls indicate very low desertion rates. What they did is they started plundering civilians. Is this a time in the war when that's acceptable? No. Not yet. Not yet. And so the Southern press has a field day with this, as they're plundering civilians in the northern Shenandoah Valley. But the northern press picks up on it too and says, oh, these Germans, these Blinkerites, they call them, we can't allow this to continue. It's given us a black eye. How do we intend to restore the Union if we're going to have this kind of activity go on? And caricatures appeared in the northern and southern press showing these German soldiers half dressed as Union soldiers and half dressed with plumed hats, a la the 30 Years' War and the plundering of German cities back then, you know, like you would have seen in the 1600s. And, you know, southern women enduring indignities such as their chickens being taken out of their hen houses, something as terrible as that. Well, this blackened the eye of the German division in the northern public. And it was fun to do for northern press correspondents. It was just a funny thing for them. It wasn't funny to the GermanAmerican public who started to get their radar put up on this. They said, uh-oh, I don't like the trend of this. It sounds a lot like the early 1850s of no-nothing. Cross Keys is their baptism by fire. Fremont bungles it. It's a lost battle. Stonewall Jackson, well, actually Richard Ewell there, serving as Jackson's proxy, beats Fremont. The German soldiery performs very well. The 8th New York marches into an ambush and is almost annihilated. Soldiery does well, but it is a defeat. This goes down as a black mark against the German division. They're transferred shortly thereafter over to the east again, where they're going to take part in 2nd Manassas. How does that work for them? Another defeat. Again, the rank and file does well, and the German officers in charge of 11th Corps do very well. But in the end, it is another Union defeat. What happens after that, then, is a very interesting situation, because we start to see the 11th Corps get formed after the residue of Antietam. The 11th Corps does not participate in Antietam. Franz Sigel is put in control of what will become the 11th Corps at the end of 1862. Perfect choice. I fight with Sigel. The Germans are happy about this. He's brought out of the Western Theater, put in charge of this great concentration of German soldiery in the 11th Corps. But the 11th Corps now has Anglo-American regiments in it. It's not just the old German division. It's been added to. It's about 60% German in the very beginning of 1863. Franz Sigel resigns. Resigns in a huff at perceived indignity that had been committed against a brother German officer. Well, he had done this before. Stanton, who was a known nativist, refuses to reinstate Sigel after this effrontery, and Sigel is therefore dismissed and put on the shelf, only to come back a year later to Battle of Newmarket. That didn't go too well for him either. But in his place, in the place of the dear Franz Sigel, is this guy. And or uh-oh Howard, as he was known by some, is a one-armed, teetotaling, West Point trained, evangelizing New Englander. Now, just based on that list of adverbs and adjectives, how well do you think he's going to get along with the Catholic, beer-drinking, and free-thinking Germans of the 11th Corps? Not well. So what we've got here is a disjoint between commander and command. And when he came into the camps of the 11th Corps, he immediately noted, if you read his memoirs, I was not appreciated. That's how it happened. He's a hard-fighting guy. You know that he lost his arm out in the peninsula. He has a good reputation as a fighting general, but he's not suited for this command. Even the Anglos underneath him are not happy to be underneath Howard. They said, no, we had been under Sigel before, and though he was a Dutchman, we knew him. We don't know this guy. So it isn't just that the Germans didn't want them, even the Anglo-American regiments didn't think this was the right match. The War Department thought this was the right match. It's going to come back to haunt them. So we have now the replacement of the beloved Franz Sigel with O.O. Howard right before the campaign at Chancellorsville. And at Chancellorsville, we know that the 11th Corps, placed on the extreme right flank of the Union Army, is itself flanked by Stonewall Jackson. And without getting into all the details tactically, what happens to the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville? Well, the popular conception is that it's surprised, but my research and German language sources indicate that about half of the German rank and file knew they were getting flanked and they were about to be attacked. In fact, the German officers in the 11th Corps under Howard, such as this fellow, Karl Schurz, knew that they were getting flanked. He had put out scouts and pickets earlier in the day while Jackson doing the Great Flank March. They actually intercepted. A guy named Hubert Karl Anton Casimir Dilger is sent out by Karl Schurz. He's one of his artillerists. He will win the Medal of Honor at Chancellorsville for his good handling of his battery on the Orange Turnpike. He will also perform very well here at Gettysburg. One of the artillerists in the 11th Corps. He's sent out by Schurz to reconnoiter what Schurz expects to be a Confederate attack. He runs into Jackson's line forming up, chased by Confederate cavalry. He escapes, comes back, tells Schurz, yep, what you thought is true, we're going to get attacked. Schurz sends him to Howard's headquarters. Howard's not there. Howard's gone south with Billy Barlow's brigade that had been requested by Daniel Sickles on his wild goose chase. As you might recall, the 3rd Corps going after what they perceive as a retreating Confederate army, but in fact it's a flanking Confederate army under Jackson. Well, this took the reserve brigade from the 11th Corps. It took their commanding officer away during the critical hours where this intel was getting to be known. And Dildors' response at Howard's headquarters from Howard's aide-de-camp is, go tell your yarn elsewhere. That's what he's told, literally. So he goes to Hooker's headquarters. What do you think Hooker's headquarters tells him? Go tell your yarn elsewhere. And in fact, they call him also an excitable Dutchman. An excitable Dutchman. So Dilger, crestfallen, goes back to Schurz, says nobody's listening. Schurz goes to Howard's headquarters at Dowdall's Tavern. Let me show you a very bad map that's taken out of my book that doesn't really give you a lot of detail. But Dowdall's Tavern is right here. Howard's headquarters. Schurz gets there as Howard comes back from his foray to the south. And he says, General Howard, we're probably going to get attacked here. Can I realign my division? Howard's response? Nope. And about a half hour later, an order comes in from General Hooker. The 12:30 order. It's a duplicate of a 9:30 order that had come earlier in the day to General Howard from Hooker, who thought that there was a chance they were going to get flanked. And he tells Howard in this order, which you can find in the official records, it's clear as day, the enemy is either retreating or he is flanking us. Take care to your flank, General Howard, and make dispositions to receive him. What you have done is not adequate. It's right there in black and white. All Howard did was put 2 regiments to face to the west and 2 guns, and that was it. So who made the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the order? And when Jackson hits with his mile long front of soldiers, preceded by scampering rabbits and pheasants and birds, the men in the 11th Corps, some of them are aware what's about to happen. The traveling feast precedes the rebel yell. And they know, sitting with rifles by their side at the campfire, the German language sources indicate this, not the English language. About half of the rank and file knew, because they had gotten the camp rumors that had been circulated by returning pickets and by people like Dilger and by their own commanders who said, yes, get ready. Everything that could be done within the chain of command was done in some of Schurz's regiments. Schurz, on his own volition, violating the spirit of what Howard had told him. When Howard said, no, you cannot realign your division, General Schurz, Schurz said, heck with that. When he went back to his positions around the Wilderness Church, he is going to realign about half of his regiments facing to the west. Here's a picture of a wilderness church from the time. So Schurz is going to have about 2,000 men ready to go facing to the west. That's not bad. When Jackson hits, it's like a thunderbolt. The men in Devon's division on the extreme flank of the Union Army, the extreme flank of the 11th Corps, are going to get pretty much stampeded, as illustrated here. It's going to be pretty bad. Maybe 5 to 6 volleys were issued by some of these regiments on the extreme right flank, 153rd Pennsylvania, 45th New York. McLean's brigade, which is primarily Anglo-American Ohio regiments, they knew that they were going to get hit. There's an example from the Anglo-American side. They went to General Devens, who was probably drunk that day, and the colonels, literally, of the regiments went and said, General Devens, we're about to get flanked. Can we do something? Can we realign? Devens said, no, there's no way. You Western colonels don't know how we do things to the East. So this isn't just stupidity on the part, that's ethnic. It isn't just an ethnic Anglo-American divide. The problems here also are just bad decision-making and judgment. And I emphasize that to my War College students when I take them to Chancellorsville. This is bad judgment, bad decision-making. Howard disobeys the superior's order, at least in spirit. And Devens is completely negligent. And he has the intel. He should have known. And he has several of his colonels coming to him and telling him. End result, Devens is swiped off. He is wiped out. And the refugees of Devens' division flee down the Orange Turnpike towards Hooker's headquarters. 2 successive stands are made, and that's where they hit. That's the modern day image. That's where we were yesterday, actually. There are 2 successive stands that are made by the 11th Corps after Devens is forced to flee. One made by Carl Schurz's men. As I said, he realigned half his division. Wilderness Church line, 6 to 6:30. 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes of time. Stalling Jackson. Why do we care? Daylight's going away. Daylight is the Confederates' friend. Night is the Yankees' friend. And the longer it takes Jackson to push in the 11th Corps, the less likely he's going to achieve his objective of cutting the Union Army off from its forts and bagging it. Jackson's out for blood. He wants to destroy the Union Army here. This is not just a pushing in of a corps. This is possible destruction he's looking for, and Daylight is eluding him. Another stand is made by the 11th Corps at the Bushbeck line. This is an actual Library of Congress image that I found. Alfred Waud was actually out there. He ran from Hooker's headquarters out to the Bushbeck line, wasn't too far away, and he started to see the forming up of it. And this is another stand made by the 11th Corps under the command of Adolf von Steinwehr, who was the division commander for Bushbeck. Bushbeck is told by Steinwehr, put your brigade in here. It's about 50% German, 2,000 rifles. After Schurz's line collapses in the Wilderness Church, about 500 yards to the west, about half of Schurz's men join Bushbeck for another 11th Corps stand. Another 3,000 to 4,000 men. Another 20 to 25 minutes taken from the Confederate attack. All of this slows Jackson down. What's that do in the greater scheme of things, operationally and strategically? Not only does the Union Army not get destroyed, buys huge time for the rest of the Federal Army to react, and I would argue forces Jackson out on that reconnaissance.
Yeah.
Big contingency point in the Civil War. I won't walk that dog any further, but I think it's very important, folks, that we recognize that these 2 successive stands by the 11th Corps are really important in greater Civil War history. But now here's an interesting question. Where are the Union press correspondents? We've got one war sketch artist out there, but where are the press correspondents of the New York Herald and the New York Times? Are they out there at the Bushbeck line watching German valor, holding Jackson up? No. Where are they located? Hooker's headquarters. Sipping brandy with old Joe. Okay, so back here, Chancellorsville, this is where this action's happening. What's the first thing that the press correspondents at Hooker's headquarters sipping brandy get to see? Retreating and cowardly poltroons, as they called them. They see the flotsam and jetsam, the rout of Devon's remainders, especially Devon's boys, joined by some of Schurz's men that do run as well. Not all of them, as I said. Many form up and keep fighting. But the first thing they see, and a lot of what they see, is retreating Dutchmen. There are retreating Anglo-Americans, too, from the Queen's Brigade, running for their lives. They don't care about that. They want to see retreating Dutchmen, and that's what they see. That's the first thing that they hear. And what do you think is the first report of Chancellorsville in the Northern Press? Flying Dutchmen let us down. Everything that had been given to them, the special beer privilege, the black bread, all this thumping of chest that Blanker had done early. Look what happened. In the end, no good. That's what we thought. They're just foreigners. We knew better in the first place. New York Times, New York Herald, the word coward is used repeatedly. What's coward in 19th century parlance? What's that mean? It means you're not a man.
Not a man.
It's worthy of getting put into a duel over. The word poltroon is used over and over. It's the same thing. Now, let me throw something else out to you here. If you are a 50-year-old German father in New York City, you're running a little brewery up there, your wife's helping you work really hard to keep bread on the table, make some very good beer. Your son's serving in the 11th Corps, and he's been wounded, but because the telegraph lines are still secure from Falmouth up to the north, you find out he's not dead. He's okay. But you know he's been badly hurt, and you start hearing in the German language paper, you read daily, that the Anglo-American papers are saying that your son's sacrifice was for naught, that he was a coward. And by the way, you just got the casualty list of the 45th New York in which your son was serving, and you see that there are an awful lot of dead and wounded in there, some captured too. And then here is the German translation of the Anglo-American editorial that just appeared in the New York Herald, saying that the 11th Corps ran without firing a shot. But over here, you see dead and wounded. What's going to be your reaction?
Forget it.
Anger, indignance. What is this? What's going on? And there was shock. The first reaction was shock. How could this be? How could they actually be saying this about us? We thought nativism was dead. No. Then it turns to indignance, then it turns to anger. And you go through the German language newspapers the whole way through May, and you see this progression. And the interesting thing, folks, is it's not just in the Eastern papers, Philadelphia, New York, where the majority of the 11th Corps German regiments came from. You're going to see it also in some of the Western newspapers, okay? This is an example of one of the Western newspapers. They, too, are carrying this. The 11th Corps was seen as the representative of German America under arms. Even though you've got these Western units that are serving independently and honorably in the Western Army under Grant and Sherman, they are not the representative of German America. It's the 11th Corps. That's the inheritor of the German division. And now these soldiers are being maligned, despite the casualties they suffered, despite the fact that you as a civilian in New York City or Chicago or St. Louis know that there were stands made by the 11th Corps that held Jackson up. You know it because your soldiers have sent letters home to the German papers to prove it. And you know that when you have high numbers of dead and wounded, that they didn't all run. What hypocrisy, you say? And the German leaders were outraged. Outraged. Letters were written. Letters were written within the army by Schurz and by Schimmelpfennig. Schimmelpfennig was unbelievably unhappy about this. He's the same guy that, of course, we know from Gettysburg, who supposedly hid in an animal shed or a pigsty. This did not help German reputations either, by the way. Quick fast forward, what happens at Gettysburg is just an added piling on of insult to German-American perceptions of how they're valued. Once again, poorly deployed. This time it's Billy Barlow's fault, not Howard. Barlow extends the line too far by going up to Walker's Knoll, and then that allows them to be more easily outflanked. They would have probably been pushed back anyway, in my opinion. But Howard had more discretion this time. It was Barlow who screwed it up. But again, the Anglo-American papers jumped. on the Germans as being cowardly. Here they go, they ran again, Flying Dutchman once again. But even worse was the vituperations that came out of the First Corps. The comrades in arms of the Germans in the Anglo-American regiments, very bad after Gettysburg. The First Corps said it's because the 11th Corps let us down that we were so cut up. Never mind what the Confederates did. The 11th Corps broke first. They uncovered our flank, and that allowed us to get flanked. Well, no, that's not how it happened. We know that. But they blamed the 11th Corps, and they said, it's your fault, 11th Corps. This stung the soldiers in the 11th Corps just as bad as the stings that came out of Chancellorsville. So you've got this double whammy experience for the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, German birth, serving in the 11th Corps. And Schimmelpfennig represented it very well when he said, the soldiers of this command, it was his brigade at Chancellorsville, and they come to him after this. This really summarizes it nicely. He says, soldiers of this command come to me with hat in one hand and Anglo-American paper in the other, and say, is this a reward for my bravery? The prurient pens of those who would dip them in the blood of the slain claim that we are cowards. In the name of the dead soldiers of my command, I demand justice. He writes this, it's in the official records, and he writes this to Carl Schurz, who then endorses it and writes another 10-page letter and endorses it, sends it to Howard. Howard endorses it, but says nothing, and sends it to Hooker. What happens then? Stops. Schurz demanded a court of inquiry about Chancellorsville, never got it. The Committee on the Conduct of the War that investigates the disaster at Chancellorsville never brings in Howard, never brings in Schurz, never brings in Schimmelpfennig, but they bring in Alfred Pleasanton, who, of course, knew everything about what was going on with the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville, but he wasn't anywhere close. Why they interviewed him, I don't know. And Dan Sickles is interviewed on shift. What did he know? But they all take the party line because by then they've read the Anglo-American newspaper accounts that say the Germans all ran, and they just repeated. They just repeated. And so there's no sense of closure for the Germans of the North, and the accusations of prejudicial nature that come in such great quantity. The 11th Corps is broken up after Gettysburg. A third of it is sent to the Sea Islands of South Carolina. It will do garrison duty there. Those guys will ultimately be transferred up to West Virginia for the very exciting railroad duty guarding against guerrilla attacks in West Virginia for most of '65. Some of the Pennsylvania regiments out of Philadelphia are in there, 74th and 75th PA. The regiments have been diluted because the men are not realistic. Here's an example of what happened. After Chancellorsville, these rank and file soldiers are writing letters saying, Brother Otto, do not enlist. I will not forget what they did to us after Chancellorsville. I will not re-enlist. And it's coming from all the units, from those that were sent to the Sea Islands, and even those that were sent out to relieve the siege of Chattanooga with the 12th. About 2/3 of the 11th Corps sent out there. Army of the Potomac finally got rid of its unwanted stepson. And there was political lobbying like mad after Gettysburg to do this. Meade is bombarded with requests from officers from all around the Army, get rid of the 11th Corps, get rid of the 11th Corps. Finally, he caves in and he does it. And that's part of the reason the 11th Corps, a big reason, was sent out, and nobody else. It's the 11th and the 12th. Those of you that know the 12th Corps' history can also surmise why they were chosen too. They also had not been part of the core of the Army of the Potomac. If you weren't with the original McClellan Army, you weren't good enough by 1863. And that's part of the reason I think the 11th and the 12th were sent out to the relieving of the siege out in Tennessee. Fast forward a little bit. So you've had this nativistic experience during the war. Not really positive. You're a soldier, you served throughout the war, 75th Pennsylvania, Philadelphia German Regiment. Served with honor, got wounded in Chancellorsville, but you survived. You mustered out in 1865. You didn't desert, that was typical, but you didn't serve with great enthusiasm either. What's going to be your recollection of the Civil War? How are you going to think about this conflict in the post-war years? Yeah, not really that. It was a tough time. You know, I thought I was signing up to prove my ethnicity's worth and to preserve the Union, to shed my blood, if necessary, for the defense of the flag, and I got spits in the face throughout a lot of this experience. And interestingly, even on garrison duty, this kind of thing persisted. You know, the Germans were always selected by brigade commanders to do fatigue duty, to do trench duty, to dig latrines. It didn't matter. I mean, it happened in the West and in the East, and you can see those also evidenced throughout the historical record. So the Germans are thinking, you know, we weren't valued that much. We were called cowards. Immediately after the war in 1865, Friedrich Kapp, who was one of the great political leaders of German America in the East, had a big speech in a little picnic grove outside of New York City, attended by thousands. And he said in his speech, "The time is only recently past when we Germans too rapidly chose to assimilate to please the Americans. We found out what happened when we did that. Germans, be proud of your Deutschtum. Be proud of your Germanness. Relish it, support it, hold on to it. Do not easily give it up, because you will be a better American if you are more German." This is called cultural pluralism, the idea that you can be both a good American and a good ethnic at the same time. Interestingly, Susanna Earle has said the same process happened with the Germans. The melting pot thesis, folks, is falling into disrepute. It is not supported by the ethnic sources. And they're the ones that we should pay attention to, not what Anglo-Americans wrote in their regimental histories in the 1880s and 90s. They're prejudicial, they have an agenda to grind, and they did. Very few of the Anglo-American English language sources actually tried to tell an unbiased account. You look at the German side, the Irish side of the story of the Civil War, and you get a very different picture. And you got to balance that against the Anglo-American, because sometimes they went too far off their side too. The ethnics tried to tout themselves and thump their chest saying they did more than they did. But if you balance this out, you start to get a different picture of what the Civil War meant. And it was not a great assimilative experience for either of the two great ethnicities of the North. If anything, it reinforced their ethnicity, and it made them proud of who they were, and made them think that we need to retain our ethnic traits as long as possible, because you know what? We can be gifters to the new republic by doing so. We can actually make the new union better. Hence, we see kindergartens established all over the North. That was a German, really, it was a propaganda campaign that succeeded. Kindergartens that was pushed, seen as a great thing that the Germans can give the American people. The idea of the Frankfurter, the idea of certain German foods, very, very pushed and very strong. German beers, very favored and preferred in the 1880s and 1890s. German arts and literature, the great piano makers were all German. The great cigar makers were all German. And the Germans argued in their literary journals in the post-war era, and their historical journals also, that if we tout how great we are as Germans and our ethnic traits that are favorable, not only will we be more accepted by the Americans who didn't want to accept us in the Civil War, but we will be better Americans and make the country better as a result. It was not until World War I that the power of German American ethnicity was broken. That's what killed it. And Frankfurters became hot dogs, and sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. It took till then. The great urban neighborhoods of Germans persisted, though, into the 1950s and 60s, and there are still 2 German language newspapers published in the United States today in Chicago and New York City. Very small little ethnic enclaves, much shrunken from what they once were. But my main argument, folks, is that the Civil War and the experience of nativism that was unleashed upon the Germans during that time was the great defining experience of the war for them, more than actually anything else. And it made them really question their place in American society after the war was over, and think twice about assimilating wholeheartedly, as Friedrich Kapp insinuated, but instead do it on their own time, in their own pace, and in their own way. And they did it. World War I hastened it. And this, I think, makes the Civil War a watershed moment, in the Battle of Chancellorsville specifically, the key sub-moment in the history of German America after the American Revolution. Thanks very much, guys.
Howard survive after Chancellorsville, knowing where his true place was, Gettysburg? He seemed to always just come out.
He always does, doesn't he? Okay, I wondered the same thing in my research, and Howard does not get the blame for Chancellorsville because he essentially lets the buck be passed to the soldiers. He does not stand up and take the accusations in place of the soldiers, something a good commander today would do. Hooker blames the soldiers, the German soldiery of the 11th Corps. The Northern papers blame the German soldiery of the 11th Corps. They go after also Howard. But Howard really doesn't get the odium. It's deflected more to his German soldiers in the reports done by the Army High Command and also by the Anglo-American press.
And it happened the same thing in Gettysburg.
And at Gettysburg, we see a Union victory in the end. And that Union victory subsumes, in some ways, what had happened to Howard's Corps. Moreover, it was understood that Howard put the reserve on Cemetery Hill, and he made the decision to leave von Steinwehr up there, and he gets the thanks of Congress for that, as you know. That is remembered, not the pushing back of his corps in official histories and in the High Command. And in fact, it's interesting, there's this sense of camaraderie and sense of, poor Howard, he's gotten hit again. These poor Dutch won't fight. There's almost a sense among his fellow Anglo-American officers of pity that Howard's afflicted with these Germans, and it's not his fault.
And he lost an arm fighting.
Oh, and you know, he'd already proven his worth, so this is not Howard's fault. This must have been Schurz's fault, or this was Schimmelpfennig, or the soldiers again. And interestingly, Howard himself attempts to resign and get out of the 11th Corps. He wants to get transferred to be the new Corps commander of the 2nd Corps, because Hancock's out of action, as you know. And he actually tries for this, but he won't get it. And that tells me that he, too, wanted out from underneath the mantle of the 11th Corps and will reluctantly leave the 11th Corps when most of it is transferred to the West. You will not find in his official autobiography, and very little in his papers, very little, any kind of prejudicial language against the Germans. It's just conspicuously absent, which makes me wonder it either got edited out, or he really didn't have a lot of prejudice towards the Germans, but also didn't believe that he should take the fall. And that's a complex answer to a very good question. Sir?
I want to ask you a question, comments on perhaps a third class of Germans, which I know besides an ancestor in that. These were folks that came over, my great-great-uncle's parents came about 1835, settled in Germantown, Philadelphia. And I believe, but by that time, when he was born around that time, service or recruited in the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserve, which I believe is a term recruited in Germantown, I think. But they were English speaking. Yeah. And I wonder if that makes the difference.
It makes a big difference, and I get into this in my book. The bulk of ethnically German soldiers in the Union Army serve in non-ethnic regiments.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for coming. About 25% of all German-speaking troops are in ethnic regiments. That leaves a large percentage, the majority, in non-ethnic. Now let's think about why that is. They are going to be recruited in the little locales where they had gone, especially the farmers among them. They went out into the Midwest where there was cheap land before the war. It was offered for them. They became parts of these rural communities, and they joined local regiments that were raised in those rural communities. Same thing happened in Pennsylvania. You will see the regiments out of Lancaster County and Berks County, which are highly Pennsylvania Dutch. They will join the 151st, they will join the 93rd, they will join some of these other regiments that are raised in the local area, but they have a very Pennsylvania German flavor because of the majority population being Pennsylvania German, but they don't see themselves as an ethnic regiment, nor do their commanders, who are often Anglo-American. And you know, you have to go back and look at this. Where are the majority of these soldiers serving? Now, what we have found from letters in German written to relatives back in Germany, there's a great archive over in Germany that has compiled a lot of these. And Walter Kampherfner and Wolfgang Helbig, two of my German colleagues, put all this together, along with a couple other things they've collected over the years. It's called Letters They Wrote Home. Germans in the American Civil War. Helbich, H-E-L-B-I-C-H, and Kamphoefner, K-A-M-P-H-O-E-F-N-E-R. It's a complex last name, like many of them are. Okay, here's what they found with the mixed regiments that were not ethnically German, had high percentages of Germans. Germans congregated in their ethnic companies. They stayed ethnically enclaved within the regiments that were not classified as ethnic, but they congregated with fellow ethnics. The Germans stuck with them. They wanted the cohesion, the feeling of camaraderie, ethnic identity that they got by being together with fellow Germans within these companies in the greater non-ethnic regiment. So you see that a lot. So we're starting to think more and more as we look into more and more on the regiments that had percentages of Germans but were not ethnic regiments, like these urban regiments I mentioned. They still segregated themselves. And they did that because they wanted to. Because they wanted to go through the war serving with brothers in arms that were like them. And they would not rub shoulders with the Anglo-Americans. See this with the Irish too. You look at the regiments that had high components of the Irish, even in the southern armies, where you have Louisiana Tigers recruited out of New Orleans. High percentages of Irish, they're all in Irish companies. They are not spread out. The Irish and Louisiana Tigers, those various regiments, are almost all in their own ethnic Irish companies within the greater regiment. There's this commonality we're starting to determine here. And Susanna and I have had many fine conversations over various beverages talking about the commonalities. And it's fascinating. And you know, another thing I'll just throw out here, guys, think about why we care about all of this. The Germans were as politically important with their clout and as numerous as today's aggregate Hispanic American population. And I'm saying that aggregate because just like the Germans, where the Prussians and the Bavarians didn't like each other, you know, the experiences of today's Hispanic Americans are diverse also. The Cubans are not the same as the Guatemalans and all this, and they don't always get along. But the numbers and the political clout aggregately, that's a huge percentage. Then and today, throw the Irish in the mix. The Irish are kind of like today's Asian Americans in their clout and numbers. Two very significant ethnic groups, then and today. And Lincoln has a strategic problem when he starts losing the political support of both. And in 1864, he will lose the Irish vote resoundingly. Not that he thought he was going to get it, but he loses it far worse, like 80% against Lincoln in Fort McClellan in 1864 for the Irish. He loses resoundingly for the Germans at 65%. McClellan in the German vote. So he won a slight majority, like 55%, went Lincoln in 1860. So something convinced the Germans to go against him, even though the North was winning the war. And I think that something has to do with nativism. I can't prove it 100%. Yeah. Sir?
No, I was just thinking, in a way you answered my question, because the way that we do ethnic politics today, close into history, you know, Otto von Bismarck would have had no problems. And, you know, and I'm wondering to what degree, a little bit of personal background where, you know, Catholic and Lutheran don't mix.
It did.
German is,
yeah.
I mean, maybe it does too, you know, when you have a O.O. Howard, but if it comes to your daughter marrying a Lutheran, that's just they might as well go Irish.
Well, let me tell you, now you're getting into the ethnic history of the 19th century, and I got into a lot of this in my dissertation and in my first book, Damn Dutch. Unquestionably correct. The Northern Germans didn't like the Southern Germans and vice versa. And, pardon?
High and low.
Oh yeah, it was, the Prussians were not appreciated and did not get along with Southern Germans writ large, and even some of the Southern German states had a little animosity among them. Remember, Germany isn't unified yet. And
yeah, there were what, 74 different states?
72.
72.
You know, it's right after the Franco-Prussian War. Now, interestingly, German America, through the cauldron of the Civil War, starts to unify faster than the real Germans, if you will, back in Germany. It takes the...
Well, they have a common...
They have this common experience, and it starts to forge them together so that in 1864, most of the German Republicans support Fremont. not Lincoln. And of course, the Democrats are going to go McClellan. But that too also indicates you got the political divide among the Germans, so you can't just say, and the thing that really got me going was despite these fractures within the German-American community, pre-war and during the war, this nativism or racism. You look at the Republican German papers, the Philadelphia Press is very Republican, very pro-Lincoln, unbelievably mad about what happens at Chancellorsville. They are some of the most reactive to the New York City press. And they actually are quoting German Democratic papers saying, right on, Westliche Post, right on, New Yorker Stadtzeitung, you're right on target. And you'd never see that. You would never see, you know, Republican and Democratic papers, whether German or Anglo, before the war, saying anything positive about each other. But yet, this common thing of nativism is making them start to unify. And it is a fascinating process. So I argue that some of the divisions and the fractures start to seal up and go away. Not all, but they start to go away a little bit, and it's the creation of this.
But isn't that a difficult argument, given the fact that by the time you get to, because now my other part of my question was, how people are in this country are perceiving German, because there's a hell of a lot going on in Europe, in what will become Germany. At this particular time. So it's not like the Irish where they're in one situation and that's kind of, this is an ongoing thing where you're getting Prussians and it's looking, one Prussian is looking one way, you know, Bavaria is looking another way, and all the principalities and whatever. And the problem I have, I think that should be included, but the other issue is that I'm not sure that the German-American divides ever really disappear, because by the time you get to only a couple decades later, nobody wants to be known as German for any reason.
Well,
because you're fighting Germany, and
the German-American divides, though, don't have to do with why people don't want to be German. It doesn't matter.
What I mean is the consensus idea is more or less, well, now it's a really good time to be all American, and forget about the German-American part. Let's all be American.
That had little to do with pre-existing fractures within the German-American community, and more to do with the pressures put out by the federal government and by zealous, patriotic American citizens who really wanted to make sure that the German-American element was put down. And that's pretty well documented, actually, that in World War I, German America almost disappears in the public's mindset overnight because the Germans themselves shut themselves down, knowing that if they don't, they're going to get hauled off to concentration camps, which existed during the World War I era in the United States. We had them, and there's a great book written in German about this called Fremde Ausländer. It's in German, unfortunately, hasn't translated it, but it's all about resident aliens and how German and Austrian aliens, and some of them are naturalized citizens, are rounded up into camps. 170,000 are rounded up into camps and kept there for some of the American involvement in the war. Most of them not there for the entire period. But you know, we don't just do it to the Japanese, we do it to the German-speaking element in World War I, a percentage of them, not all. But if you said one thing wrong, the American government rounded you up and put you in a camp. And so the pressure is mainly, to kill German America. It's the Germans themselves responding to the incredible outward pressure exerted upon them. They say, oh, wait a second. If we don't start to play ball here, if we try to say, wait a second, we're not that bad, we're going to get crushed. And they allowed themselves to implode. But your earlier point about the fact that the pre-existing fractures do not go away just because of the experience of nativism in the war is 100% accurate. And there is still animosity. Even after everything in the war, that is still a residue of the old country that will still persevere into the 1880s and 90s, for instance. And the Southern Germans still don't like the Northern Germans through that period. And they still look at them askance and say, oh, the Prussians, look what they're doing. There was, though, a sense of jubilation in the German-American community when Germany's unified. And it's hard to explain, except that it fell under the rubric of the greater German-American population seeing this as a way to tout the excellence of being German to the American public, saying, look what we've got. We now have unified, we've overcome all the problems we had before. And yeah, our brethren back home got it together and figured it out. And hey, we beat the damn French. And they used to be the big boys on the block. And we too, over here, can offer you Americans other great things. And so there was a sense of common jubilation in the German victory. It did not erase these pre-existing fractures completely, but it helped reduce them. So, you know, it's a nebulous thing to try to prove it. You know, you go through the literary journals and the historical journals, and you find trends, and you find patterns, and historians look for patterns. And good historians will try to acknowledge, well, pattern doesn't mean perfection, doesn't mean 100%. It means a likelihood. And because we're not alive then, we don't know what they actually were thinking and how much of this was spouting forth stuff that people wanted to hear versus what was really the truth. That's another issue too. So you have to kind of sift through this and kind of get a feel for it based on handling the primary sources. And that's what I try to do. If I had gone through every last possible German-American post-war journal and paper to get all of this 100%, to get the feel down, I still wouldn't have been able to say with absolute conclusiveness these arguments. I would probably be further along in my belief that they are correct, but I wouldn't be able to tell you 100% this is absolutely what happened. We'll never know. We'll never know 100%, but we can get a pretty good idea, get a good feel. And that's what I tried to do, looking at what I did. And it's a very interesting question of how war influences society afterwards and changes things and makes people think differently. And how long does that last? And when you've got a minority population, what's the difference there as opposed to compared to a majority population? Tough questions. Stuff makes your brain ache. Yeah. Makes your brain ache. Good stuff.
Sounds like you've done most of your research on Pennsylvania, or the parts of the 11th Corps that were more eastern. Have you done some on the Wisconsin parts of it?
I did. 26 Wisconsin, just incredibly well documented, and I got a lot of great stuff on them that I have in my second book. And in fact, they wrote some of the greatest letters home after Chancery stuff. The most vivid and beautifully written comes out of the 26 Wisconsin, and luckily a lot of them got preserved. The people had the descendants had the foresight to hold on to these letters, and they kept them, and they got published early.
Yeah. Because
it was such a big component, comparatively speaking, of Wisconsin history. The Civil War, think about it, Wisconsin was a newer state, and Civil War is this great moment in Wisconsin's early history, whereas with Pennsylvania and New York, we've had the whole colonial experience. Oh, Civil War letter, we got hundreds of those. That's not as,
The Wisconsin Historical Society started not that long after the Civil War.
Right.
So, I'm looking at stuff from one of the men from Oshkosh in the 26th.
That's neat.
But I don't
You got Pula's book, right?
No.
You gotta get PULA. It's called the Siegel Regiment, and it is a regimental history of the 26 Wisconsin.
Oh, I know there was one. I haven't got it.
It's Pula, PULA. What's his first name? He used to be dean at Catholic University.
At Marquette or
No, Catholic University.
Catholic,
Yeah,
okay.
in Washington, and he has done a lot of work on the ethnics back in the 70s and 80s, but he finally got this regimental history done. It's really well done, and you're going to find a lot of great information there.
Yeah, I know the one man that I'm following, the Oshkosh Museum is in the process of translating it because I don't read German, so it's a little harder for me. Yeah, it's really, really rich. They've used a lot of his stuff, and they've got some of it translated.
Nice.
And he was captured at Gettysburg.
Was he?
So yeah, I've got him, and I've got someone from
What was his name?
Joseph Arnold.
That's probably why he go to look, because the last name doesn't sound
It doesn't
conspicuously
sound
German.
But all of his stuff, rich correspondence, all in German.
Neat.
At least that's what they tell me. I haven't seen it yet. But I'm using him, and then a man from Oshkosh that was captured Iron Brigade, and they both were taken to Richmond, and their experiences are very different.
There's no doubt of that.
Yeah, because one was in Libya and one was on Belle Island because of their status.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the Oshkosh Museum has all of that. And so you've got some stuff. Yeah, I'm in this learning. But I'm interested. I'm from that area, so very German area. Schwartz has statues
Check
in
out
Oshkosh.
Check out the Wisconsin Democrat with a K.
Okay.
That's the great German newspaper that was dominant there. It was, of course, Democratic.
Is that Milwaukee?
Yeah, Demokrat. The Oshkosh guys would have gotten this if they were Democratic.
Oh, yeah.
And there are some translations done of the Wisconsin Democrat, not many. All right, guys. What a good time. Enjoyed it. Thanks.